Good morning. So today I'm going to tell you a story. And this is a story based on a story that Jesus told in Luke 15. So be aware as you listen of who you are in this story. Who do you identify with? And also, as you listen mostly with these questions in your mind. What is the Father waiting for? What is the deepest longing of his heart? And how can I give him what he desires? Sitting on the porch, gazing wistfully down the road, the father's mind drifted back to when his boys were toddlers. Misty-eyed, he remembered their chubby little hands clapping gleefully as they danced away their days, immersed in the joyous melody of childhood. The echoes of their laughter floated back to him as he relived glorious adventures, romping with them through mysterious forests, splashing together in playful streams. They were his boys, and he loved them so. He groaned softly, wondering what went wrong. His heart ached with the agony of desire, just to sit and talk with either of them again. What a pleasure that would be. He trembled with joy at the thought. But gazing down that dusty road, empty as far as the eye could see, he sighed as if his heart would break. Would he ever see his youngest son again? Would the yearning of his love ever be enough to draw the boy's wondering heart back home? His gaze shifted to the field, where his oldest child was working with the hired hands. At least he could see this son. At least he knew his oldest child was safe. And yet, there was a sullen silence about this boy that pierced the father's heart even deeper than the absence of his reckless young brother. Every day they talked about profits and loss, about crops and weather, about duties and responsibilities. And every day the father watched with a heavy heart as his son turned away from him to work in the fields. Did this child of his ever dream? What were his wildest hopes, his deepest fears? Did he share the desires of his heart with anyone? Did he even know he had a heart? The father bowed his head in silent agony. The tears of a broken heart splashed unnoticed on his trembling hands. How long? How long would he have to wait? How could he bear this agony of desire any longer? The sun sank lower on the horizon as the father embraced his sorrow. The longing in his heart grew stronger every day. The pain of keeping the flame of hope alive intensified with each passing moment. With an effort, crippled by the hopeless despair that threatened to engulf him, the father let his gaze wander for the millionth time down that dusty road. But wait! Did he detect a slight movement way out on the edge of the horizon? He jumped to his feet, energized by the desperate longing that engulfed him. Could it be? Perhaps his long-lost son was coming home. His heart leaped with eager anticipation as he lunged off the porch, running toward the dusty road. The oldest son, working in the field, glanced up as his father ran by. His face twisted in rage and disgust. He clenched his fist, allowing the bitterness he had nursed all those years to course through his veins. Stalking off to a distant field, he muttered to himself, "There he goes again. I can't stand to watch him run down that road every time he sees something move, all because of that worthless son of his. Any other father would have disowned him long ago. Not this guy. He just sits on that porch and mopes. All he ever thinks about is that ungrateful scoundrel." Seething, he picked up a rock, throwing it with all his might to the edge of the field. "This stupid, rocky soil makes crop production impossible," he fumed. "I work my tail off on this God-forsaken farm. What do I get in return? Nothing, absolutely nothing, except disgruntled hired hands to deal with, because that uselessly depressed landowner who is supposed to be running this place just sits on the porch and mopes all day." Viciously, the furious man yanked out a stubborn scrub bush. "If it's not rocks, it's weeds. That's all we ever grow around here," he muttered. Clenching his teeth, he crushed the drooping plant in his hand. "You," he spat, "you're just like that vagabond brother of mine. He hung around just long enough to have all the fun. Then, when it came time to do his share of the work, he split. Of course, he stayed around long enough to talk his spineless father into giving him his share of the inheritance. His share? Ha! He never earned a penny of it. And now he's wasting it all, partying with his friends." I'm out of... "While I slave away to get my pittance." Reaching the edge of the farthest field, he mercilessly beat the hapless scrub bush to a pulp. His dark thoughts engulfed him. That runaway kid should have been whipped and disowned years ago. The reckless, irresponsible brute doesn't deserve love. The crazy old man just doesn't sit on the porch and mope for me. Ha! He hardly knows I exist, except that this joke of a farm would fall apart if I weren't running it. Stomping the bruised remains of the limp weed into the ground, the furious man ranted and raved, his rage nourishing the bitterness that had taken firm root in his heart. Far in the distance, unnoticed by his angry son, the father was gasping for breath, a growing excitement coursing through his veins. His heart beat wildly as he rushed on, his eyes fixed on the lone figure still barely visible on the horizon. Could this possibly be his long-lost child? The very thought of it caused his heart to leap for joy. This had to be his son. He couldn't bear the agony of waiting any longer. The father ran on faster and faster, barely noticing the sneering faces of the neighborhood youth who had taken to mocking and jeering every time he ran by. He knew people were laughing at him all over town. They had been for years. Even when his boys were little toddlers, he was thought of as weird because he objected to the story that was often told at neighborhood parties, intended to deter restless youth from leaving home. People would gasp incredulously whenever he insisted that he would never disown his sons, even if they told him they wished he were dead. The father quickened his pace, eager anticipation driving him on. Tears of joy stung his eyes, blurring the distant figure even more. Yet he knew it was his son. It had to be his son. He had known long before it happened that this boy would ask for his inheritance and leave home. He had seen the restless longing in his eyes. He had patiently answered his endless questions about the world beyond the nearby village. And he had decided, long before his precious child had asked, that he would give him his freedom, his inheritance, and his father's blessing. His mind raced as he hurried on. He thought of the scorn and derision his neighbors had flung at him when his boy had left home, their screams of rage and disgust when he had liquidated some of his possessions to waste on that ungrateful scoundrel hadn't even fazed him. He knew their accusations were right. His determined insistence that he would never disown his children, no matter what they did, had given his son the courage to request his inheritance before he left. But he also knew what they didn't care to know. His long-lost son, more precious to him than all the wealth in the universe, would remember his father's generosity and blessing and find the courage to come home. Barely noticing his own labored breath, the father quickened his pace. The moment his aching heart had been longing for all these years could not be put off a second longer. He rushed breathless around a bend in the road. A cry mingled with ecstatic joy and anguished pain escaped his trembling lips. "My son, my long-lost son!" His long-lost son was coming home, but the filthy, tattered rags that hung from his shrunken, almost unrecognizable form pierced the father's heart. Why, oh why, had he waited so long? Didn't he know his father had been watching, longing every moment for his return? The father stood, frozen in the road, paralyzed by the emotions surging through him. His son, who had been shuffling along with his head hung low, slowly lifted his gaze to meet his father's eyes. The compassion, grief, and joy he saw there was more than he could bear. He looked away quickly, staring uneasily at the caked mud on his bare feet. With tears streaming down his face, the father cried out, "My son, my son!" In a voice choked with shame and remorse. The son groaned, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son." But his voice was muffled by his father's embrace. The father clung to his beloved son and wept unashamed. He had waited so long. The thrill of unimaginable joy almost overwhelmed him. He felt his precious child's body tremble as he fought back convulsive sobs, choking out his confession. "Father, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired men." "I forgive you, my son," the father cried as he continued to embrace his precious child. "All is forgiven." The father gently held his boy at arm's length, gazing lovingly into his eyes as he repeated the deeply heartfelt words, "I forgive you, my son." At that moment, two servants ran up, gasping for breath. One of their assigned jobs was to follow their employer every time he ran down the road, which happened several times a day. The father, in his eagerness to greet his son, had run far ahead each time, but always before he had come back, dragging his feet, looking dejected and heartbroken. This time was different. This was the moment the father had been waiting for, longing for, planning for all these years. His long-lost son had returned. With tears of joy still streaming down his face, the father turned to his servants and gave the instructions he had rehearsed day after day in anticipation of his dear son's return. "Quick," he said eagerly to the housekeeper, "bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet." Then he turned to the head cook. "Kill the calf we've been fattening in the pen," he said. "We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found." Having sent the servants scurrying off to complete their assigned tasks, the father laid his arm lightly across his beloved son's shoulders and gently nudged him toward an old stump by the side of the road. He had no intention of allowing his precious child to walk past the scoffing, jeering neighbors until he had the ring with the family seal on his finger, the robe saved for passing royalty around his shoulders, and the sandals on his feet to prove to the world that he was not homeless. Finally, after long, endless years of waiting, the father's intense desire to sit and talk with his dear son was satisfied. He listened intently as the young man poured out his heart, telling his father where he had been and what he had learned. He spoke haltingly, almost fearfully at first. Overwhelmed by his good fortune, he thought maybe his dad would change his mind if he really knew all the terrible things he had done. Feeling hopelessly unworthy of the royal treatment being lavished upon him, the son wept uncontrollably, pouring out his story in heartfelt confession and repentance. His dad's tears mingled with his as the story unfolded. Gazing into his father's eyes, the young man was astonished to discover that the love and acceptance pouring from his father's heart grew more intense with each passing second. How could that be? He would never be the same. Amazing love had captured his heart forever. The housekeeper came then, bringing the new sandals, the signet ring, and the royal robe, all of which the father had lovingly stored away in anticipation of the return of his precious child. His eyes danced with joy as he fastened the sandals onto his son's cracked and bleeding feet. "My son," he cried softly, "welcome home." Tears of joy streamed down his cheeks as he held his son's hand tenderly in his own, slipping the family signet ring onto his fingers. "You will, from this day forward, stand by my side as a valued adult member of this family," he declared solemnly. Then, drawing from its box the rich, costly robe saved exclusively for visiting royalty, the father tenderly placed it around his son's shoulders, proclaiming in a choked-up voice, "My son, you are far more important to me than all the kings and queens in this world. You are royalty to me. Welcome home." And so they walked down the familiar road together toward home. The once scoffing neighbors watched in silent amazement as the procession passed. No king was ever more proud to have the royal prince, his own treasured son, walking by his side. Dancing with joy, the father proclaimed loudly to everyone he saw, "Do you remember my son? My dear, precious son has finally come home. Come, let us feast and celebrate. For the one who was lost has been found. The one who was dead is alive again. Come, let us feast and celebrate." So the grand procession grew as curious friends and neighbors followed in amazed astonishment. "The crazy old man," they muttered. "Children who treat their parents the way this scoundrel has treated his father should be shunned, excommunicated from the family, as if they never existed. How is it that he is treated like royalty? Isn't this the wretch that asked for his inheritance before he ran away from home? This is unheard of. He may as well have spat in his father's face and screamed, 'I wish you were dead, so I could have your money.'" The father, ignoring them, continued to dance and laugh with delight, all the while yelling, "Come celebrate with me. My long-lost son has returned home. Come, let's celebrate." When he got close to his own farm, he yelled to the servants in the field, "I declare today a holiday. Come celebrate with me. My precious son has returned. Come and join the feast." So the amazing celebration began. Meanwhile, the older son, exhausted from his tirade, lay sprawled out on the ground at the edge of the farthest field. Why does that old man have to be so weird, he wondered. He has always been strange, the laughingstock of the village. I wish I had been born to a normal family. His thoughts wandered back to when he was a little boy. He had vague memories of his mother cuddling him, playing with him, singing to him. But then one day, she was gone, with no warning and no goodbye. In her place came a squalling, screaming little brat who stole all of the attention of everyone in the house. Musing bitterly, he frowned, tightening his jaw. That little thief has been gone for years, yet he still gets all the attention, and I get none. I wish he had never been born. Maybe then I would have had a chance at a normal family. Engulfed in his angry thoughts, the bitter man didn't notice at first the unusual sounds drifting through the air. Gradually, he became aware of something unfamiliar. What is going on, he wondered, as he jumped to his feet. He began walking briskly toward the house, listening intently as he drew near. He could distinguish the sounds of music and laughter, excited voices and barking dogs. It couldn't be a party, he thought. The old man has been so down in the dumps since that kid left, no one would dare to have a party. What is this all about? He called to the first servant he saw. Your brother has come, the servant replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because we have him back safe and sound. Safe and sound! The older brother shrieked incredulously. I'll wring his thieving neck. He has no right to come sneaking back here after what he's done. He ground his teeth in rage, spewing out obscenities and pounding his fists on the nearest tree. The servant backed away cautiously. He had seen his boss angry before, but never this angry. Slipping into the house, his heart pounding rapidly, the servant went in search of the father. Perhaps he could calm his raging son down. There was no telling what might happen if he couldn't. When he found him, the shaken servant began talking so rapidly, his confused employer held up his hand, imploring patiently, "Now, wait a minute. Start over and slow down. Your son, your other son, is furious. I'm afraid he might hurt himself or others. Could you go talk to..." But the father was already out the door. The anxious father stood on the porch, searching frantically for his angry son. It only took a second. He could hear cursing and shouting coming from the side of the house. As he ran toward the sound, he had to push his way into the gathering crowd. Finally breaking through, he stood frozen in his tracks, staring in unbelief at his raging son. Tears stung his eyes and a knife pierced his heart. This son of his had been sullen and withdrawn for many years, but he had always managed to control his raging temper when his father was present. Now, in astonishment, the father stepped forward to try to reason with his dear son, who was so transformed by his rage that he was almost beyond recognition. "Son, my dear son, what is the cause of your anger?" At the sound of his father's voice, the furious man whirled around. His face was red and swollen with rage. "Your brother has returned," the father pleaded. "Please come in and greet him and join the celebration for his safe return. This is a day of rejoicing. What is the cause of your fury?" Father and son stood staring at each other for an endless moment. The father, with tears rolling down his cheeks, a pleading look on his face, held his arms out toward his precious son. The enraged man just stood there glaring at his father, his chest heaving in an attempt to control his fury, enough to speak. He had always spoken very respectfully to his father. Now he spoke slowly through clenched teeth, his mouth twisting in anger. I've worked hard for you all these years and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to do. In all that time, you never gave me even one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet, when this son of yours comes back, after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the finest calf we have. Suddenly, the father understood the sullen silence that had built an impenetrable wall between his precious child and him all these years. He had tried everything he could think of to reach this boy's heart. He would have been thrilled to throw a party for this dear son and his friends. He had tried a few times, but his sullen child had always said coldly but respectfully, "No, I need to work. I don't want a party." Finally, the father had given up. He would have tried having a surprise party, but he had no clue who to invite. His son didn't seem to have any friends. Gazing deeply into his firstborn's eyes, the father searched in vain for even a hint of compassion or understanding. How could he even begin to penetrate the thick wall of contempt and bitterness that separated him from this most precious child of his? He sent a silent plea to heaven as he began to speak. "Look, dear son," he said, "you and I are very close, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he is found." Tears of joy mingled with pain ran unbidden down the father's face. What a glorious day this was. His long-lost son was home. His sullen son had openly expressed his bitterness for the first time. Looking into the seething eyes of his angry, jealous child, the father wondered how he could touch his frozen, calloused heart. He was determined. He was determined that in the days and weeks ahead, he would find a way. No matter what the cost, he would find a way. Thank you for giving your all to draw us back home to you, to draw us close to your heart. Thank you for longing for us to know you, to talk with you, to walk with you, to laugh with you, to cry with you. Thank you for touching our hearts so deeply that we have the opportunity to be in the world who you are, the waiting ones, pouring out everything in order to be in deep, meaningful, healthy relationships with people and with you. Thank you for your gift, your sacrifice, your great love. We want to be like you.